Support the author of today's story by going and checking out his YouTube channel, Black Volumes. He posts similar scary stories that you would find on this channel, and I think you'll really enjoy them. Give it a try. And without further ado, let's get into today's story. The month is May, and the year is 2024. It's a beautiful sunny day, and I'm about to go for a little drive with my family. I love my wife, I love my 2 daughters. No matter what happens, all of those things are true. And everything else is a terrifying and terrible lie. That's me, that's who I am. I don't want to forget that. I don't know how much longer I have, so I need to share my story. I need to explain what's happened to me, so that I might save others. Possibly, I don't know anymore. I don't know whether anyone can be saved from the tall crawl, the thing that lurks behind the veil of reality, an entity that tricks us so convincingly into thinking that it isn't real. But it is real, very, very real. And if its victims refuse to follow its rules, they suffer in the most direful and unimaginable ways. So here's my story. Here's my account of events from the past half a year. This recounting of events will serve as the final coherent record of the nightmare that I've been enduring for the past 6 months. As I said, I don't know how much longer I have. Don't know how much longer I have as me, I should say. In short, I appease an entity that was named by the one who cursed me as Tall Crawl. I don't understand its nature. It shifts shapes and seems unbound by physical laws. All I know is that, as I said, I must follow its rules or bad things will happen. Asinine, ridiculous rituals designed to protect not only myself, but my loved ones. 1. Do whatever he bids and do it twice if you doubt yourself. 2. Walk no fewer than 11 steps per hour. 3. Don't walk in the shade of a backwards tree. I'm aware that those rules make no sense, that they seem to serve no purpose. No purpose that makes any sense to us anyhow. And you would be right. You see, it'd be simple to say that Tall Crawl has a wicked design, that he simply relishes in my psychological torture, that he forces me to submit to his will, performing rituals that are utter nonsense. But the truth, I think, is worse than that. The truth is that these rules matter to him or it. Matter in some way that I do not understand. That is what terrifies me. Of course, nobody believes me, and why would they? Unless you experience this hell for yourself, it seems like a work of fiction, like the symptoms of mental illness. One particular mental illness, I should say. Various psychiatrists have informed me with absolute confidence that I have OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. I don't blame them for thinking so. After conducting hours of research on that debilitating disorder, I would say that I have all the requisite symptoms. Crippling anxiety, horrid thoughts swirling in my head, and rituals that help to temporarily dull the anxiety, only for it to spike again, usually twice as severely the next time. I'm 99% there, 99% identical to a typical OCD survivor. But that 1%, oh that troublesome 1%, it's what derails the reassuring argument every time. Yes, reassuring. It would be lovely for those psychiatrists to be correct. You see, I would have been thrilled to have obsessive-compulsive disorder, as terrifying and anxiety-inducing as that mental illness seems to be. I'd be thrilled to have it because I'm dealing with something far worse. OCD would be the lesser of 2 evils by a country mile. There's a big difference with what's happening to me. With obsessive-compulsive disorder, the horror that takes place in one's head. For me, however, it's all too real. Whenever I fail to follow these rules, I don't simply feel anxious. Something terrible actually happens. It all started just before Christmas, my least favorite time of the year. Not only due to the icy roads and the frozen tinge to the air, nipping at one's skin painfully. Not even due to the stresses of the holiday season itself, with family get-togethers that often end with people being upset, and presents that never seem to be quite right, where my nephews and nieces are concerned. No, this is my least favorite time of the year because it was once my favorite time of the year. I know that makes no sense, but if you had ever known my father, you would get it. You see, he developed Alzheimer's in late June of 2022, and the past 2 Christmases have just been utterly dreadful. All of the family gets upset. There's burnt turkeys, incorrect presents, and dicey drives were insignificant when Grandpa David showed up. He was a warm presence, a beacon of joy and light for all of us. And since his mental deterioration, there has been a deterioration in the very fabric of our family, in our unity and strength. I was vulnerable, and that was why it happened to me that late December of 2023. That was what let the tall crawl inside. My daughter Claire and I drove an hour to visit her grandfather in the care home. It was a dull journey even during the warmer seasons, but one that I had been making every other day since he had moved into the home back in July of 2022. And after that long and unpleasant drive, there's an even longer and less pleasant experience awaiting me inside the building itself. Now for clarity, I don't turn my nose up at the damp walls, the harsh-voiced staff members, or even the pungent smell of urine. No, it's the cries that get to me. The cries of the residents in that place. The ones who feel as if they've been left to rot, even when their loved ones visit multiple times a week, for they remember none of it. I hate it. I hate the pain, the anguish of those who suffer from the disease. What an accursed end-of-life experience. Some cruel joke from a natural force or some sadistic puppeteer of our puny existences, relishing in our suffering as it watches us from the great depths of the cosmos. Sorry, I got a little lost there. You see, I'm not myself either, and we'll be getting to that. I apologize for the dread. Once you realize the nightmare that I've been enduring for the past half a year, however, you'll understand how I've come to be this way, how I've come to be so frightened and timid and fragile, how I've come to be frightened not of the world around me, but of the terrifying forces hidden beneath the surface, the things in which I didn't used to believe. Monsters in the dark, lurking under the bed, around the corners of the farthest walls of the mind, waiting to whisper in not-so-sweet nothings. I need my wallet, Dad grumbled as he often did. 4 words that he had repeated hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, maybe thousands at that point. The tireless repetition had worn me thin, not from boredom but sorrow. As I said, it was painful to see my father that way. The proud David Roberts reduced to a lost soul. It was harrowing and horrifying in equal measure, and the nightmare I would soon learn had not even begun. I sighed, sharing a look with my daughter, who smiled softly at me. It was perhaps harder for Claire, as she was not only seeing her grandfather wither and decay and lose his soundness of mind. No, she was also seeing her father wither and decay, seeing me break down emotionally. A man who, not to toot my own horn, has always been firm, dependable, steady, and far from emotional. I like to view myself as the one to whom people come when they're struggling emotionally. But that past year had taken its toll. I had been trying to hold myself together for my family, but the fact of the matter is that Dad's mental decline had crushed me. I love that man, and I still do love him, but he's gone, and I think I finally accept that. I accept a lot of things about identity now, about how easily it can slip away when something evil and without clear purpose worms its way into one's mind, into one's very soul. Anyhow, as I said, I was holding myself together, just about. Barely, but undeniably, I was still me. I was still Claire's father, Laura's husband. I was still that dependable man. However, any attempts that I had been making to maintain some semblance of composure and sturdiness in the face of such a nightmare, it would cease by the end of that very evening. For I would face a hardship that I did not and still do not know how to overcome. Though I hope and pray for a way that I've just not seen it yet. "You don't need your wallet, Dad," I said gently, taking my father's hand, which was coated in ridges and bruises from all manner of incidents, bumps with door handles and wardrobes, and even a glass window according to one member of the staff. David Roberts retracted his hand from mine and let out a snarl like an animal that had been backed into a corner. Anger in the face of love was to be understood given his condition, but that didn't make the blow any harder. Dad used to be such a soft and happy and loving man, so it was heartbreaking to see him become this hardened and bitter shell of himself. Dad's old southern accent returned, received pronunciation aplenty. "I'll be the judge of whether I need my wallet or not, boy. And if you continue to withhold it from me, I shall have to ask one of the busboys at this hotel to bring me a telephone. That way I'll be able to ring the cops so as to have you and this girl arrested. Would you like that? Nah, I thought not, boy. Now stop this nonsense at once and let me go home. A hotel oughtn't to operate like a prison. Heavens above." "You're not at a hotel, Dad," I said, trying to stifle another sigh. "This is where you live. I know that you keep forgetting, but I'll explain it to you again because I don't like to see you upset. This is it's a residence. Everything that you need is covered. That's why you don't need your wallet, okay?" He shook his head firmly, not buying my story. And in fairness, I was smudging the truth by simply calling the care home a residence. But in my defense, I found it best not to reveal my father's condition to him. "They want to keep me locked up in here, all of them. My daughter, my bloody son. They don't even come to visit me. Did you know that?" "Your daughter Charlotte visits you once a week, and I'm your bloody son," I replied. "I'm right here. I come to visit you most nights, Dad." "Well, tell my son that I need my wallet and I need to get out of here." Dad roared, still not quite acknowledging my identity. He likely hadn't actually processed what I had said, and still thought me to be just another member of staff at the hotel in which he believed himself to be staying. "You're here for your own well-being," my daughter Claire added. "You weren't safe at home, Grandpa. You kept forgetting things, injuring yourself, forgetting to eat meals. You tripped and—" "They have all sorts of nutters in here," Dad suddenly interrupted in a hushed whisper. "The blonde one is the worst." I noticed my father's eyes wandering around the room, and grateful for the unexpected change in topic, I cast my eyes around the room to try and spot whatever he had spotted. After all, when an Alzheimer's patient surprises you by saying something different from the 3 or 4 statements repeated relentlessly throughout the day, you ought to snatch that opportunity for a new conversation, something fresh. And so I entertained Dad's sudden interest in this blonde one, who he deemed to be the worst person in the care home. I scanned the armchairs full of rambling and squirming and yelling residents, and then my eyes settled upon the person who I assumed had been the subject of my father's ire. I saw an elderly man named Michael, whose gray hair did glisten a somewhat blonde color in certain lights, squirming in his armchair. I thought back to the numerous visits that I had made over the past year and a half, and I decided that he certainly fit the bill in terms of the worst resident, from my father's perspective. Michael was certainly the loudest resident in the care home's lounge area, and that was the case every time that I visited. If my father were talking about anyone, I assumed it to be him. Michael's tears and tantrums and loud wails were often quite distracting. It was sometimes difficult to hear oneself think. Of course, not having the same mental condition as my father, I had a little more patience, a little more capacity for empathy perhaps. Well, unfortunately, Michael's struggling just like you, Dad, I explained. It's a little annoying when he talks loudly, I know, but you have to be patient with him. He's not being too loud right now, is he? We're having a nice chat. You, Claire, and me. Let's not focus on Michael. My father seemed to snap to attention. His gaze had been meandering around the room, but upon clocking what I had said, my dad locked his eyes onto Michael, the old man who was yelling so feverishly that flecks of spittle were flying onto the cheeks of the women tending to him. It was Nurse Tracy. Him? Dad asked, nodding at the old man, and then he grumbled. Oh yes, he's a right sort, a real oddball. Comes into my room at night, would you believe it? And he doesn't hear a bleeding word I say. He's always crying. Yeah, you heard me, crying. Crying and crying and crying his bleeding eyes out. He's always asking me for help, as if I know a thing about the kind of help that fella needs. An exorcism, I would wager. I tell him to get out of my room, but he doesn't listen to me. He seems almost to be talking to himself, as embarrassing as that sounds. I always tell him, this is a hotel, it's not an asylum. And he's hardly any better during the day. I mean, just look at him now, crying about that woman again. Crying about her and the thing that crawls. I raised an eyebrow, shocked not only by my father's memory, which rarely functioned any longer, but also by the nature of the story itself. Michael comes into your room at night. Dad nodded. Oh, he's a real nuisance. I might not mind too greatly, truth be told, if it weren't for his persistent tears. Always sobbing, I tell him. Do that out in the corridor if you must, but get out of my bleeding room. Well, that's not good, my daughter said. Dad, we should tell someone. I nodded. I will, Claire. She's right, Dad. It definitely isn't right for other residents to be wandering into your room. Certainly not at night when you're trying to sleep. But don't you worry, I'll make sure that I sort it out with the runner of the establishment and we'll... Huh? Dad interrupted as seemingly having lost his train of thought again. You're always blabbering on about something, aren't you, boy? All I need is my bleeding wallet. I have a right mind to call the police if you keep up this tomfoolery. You're withholding my personal property. Dad, I groaned. My father ignored me. Now listen here, I want my wallet and I want your telephone. Then I'm gonna book a taxi to take me straight home. And I shall never be returning to this place. You'd better believe that I'll ensure none of my friends have the misfortune of staying here either. Now you'd better do as I say right this instant, and maybe you'll count your lucky stars to not be named in the scathing review that I'll leave for this place. What's your name, boy? I sighed, shaking my head as I rose to my feet. I need to have a chat with the nurse about what you just told me. I'm going to leave Claire with you for a second, Dad. Is that okay? My father's glassy eyes barely registered me. He grumbled something incoherent, and Claire looked at him sadly and then turned her face up to me. When she did, I mouthed the same question to her. Is that okay? She nodded, silently telling me that she could cope with Dad. If anything, she had a better handle on dealing with him than I did. So I patted her softly on the shoulder, leaving the two of them to discuss any of the few conversations that my father liked to repeat unrelentingly. and then I walked across the lounge and cleared my throat behind the nurse who had finished tending to Michael. That shy woman named Tracy, only in her early 20s, who I had never managed to catch for more than a handful of words here and there. It wasn't that I had respected her introverted nature. It was that I had always felt somewhat inclined to avoid her, for a reason that I didn't yet understand. But I would. You see, on this day, she was different. Nurse Tracy turned to face me, and the first thing that struck me was the smile on her face. The first smile that I had ever seen on her. She had been meek and withdrawn for the 4 or 5 months that she had spent working at the care home. But now she was positively beaming with life. With energy, a kind of energy that I didn't understand. I knew only that I did not like it. That I didn't want to know what had changed her so dramatically from 2 days before, when I had last visited the care home. "Hello, Mr. Roberts," she chirpily said. "Is everything okay with your father?" I sighed deeply. "Well, yes and no, Tracy. Sorry, I don't mean to alarm you. In a sense, he's okay, he's fine, but..." Tracy shot out a hand that seized me firmly and, truth be told, alarmingly at the wrist. There was untold strength to her grip. I had never felt such strength from a man or a woman before. She didn't hurt me, but she held me so firmly to the spot that I knew, even if I were to try, I wouldn't have been able to move. And then my fearful gaze met hers, met those eyes which were looking a little bloodshot. Unhealthily and unnaturally bloodshot. I paused, holding that gaze. I found myself waiting for her to fix herself, to go back to the old Tracy, to go back to being anything even marginally more human. Heck, I told myself that I would settle as soon as she simply blinked. And as she did, thankfully, but it seemed to take a few seconds too long. There had been too much of a gap. Too long spent eyeing me without letting those eyelids close. Something was wrong with her face. Everything was wrong with her face. And her words were even worse. "Spit it out, Mr. Roberts," Tracy whispered curtly, but in a faux friendly tone. A tone that seemed at odds with the content of her demand. It would have been better if she had sounded cross. But the gentleness and pleasantry of her tone only made the words more horrible. I gulped, no longer wanting to tell the nurse what was wrong, no longer wanting to spend another second speaking to her. "Well, my father told me something a little concerning." "Yes?" Tracy interjected immediately, hardly allowing me a second to breathe after finishing my sentence. "He said that..." I began and then nodded at Michael, who was sitting just behind the nurse, muttering to himself. I didn't want to draw too much attention and make him uncomfortable. "This gentleman here has been coming into his room at night. My father said that the man's been crying, asking for help with something. I don't know. I'm not too worried about what the resident's been saying. It's more about the intrusion itself. Listen, I know nothing malicious is happening. We are in a care home. People aren't well, I understand. I'm sure this gentleman has simply been getting lost, perhaps even trying to find a member of staff to assist him with, well, something. I know that he hasn't been intending to stumble into my father's room. But this is on you and your team to stop these things from happening, wouldn't you say?" Tracy gasped, and it felt like another performative stunt, another disingenuous display of emotion, much like the thin veil she had draped over her anger or contempt or insidiousness when she had spoken curtly before. It was a falseness designed not only to mock, but to threaten me. And yes, I'm aware of how unnerving and disconcerting that may seem, but you weren't there, you didn't hear it. Didn't hear her awful, inhuman voice. Didn't see that awful, inhuman face. Well, that just simply won't do now, will it? Tracy eventually said before finally releasing my wrist and placing her hands on her hips. It was as if her brain had malfunctioned, had switched to standby midway through replying to me. I truly didn't want to spend another moment speaking to her, but I pushed onwards anyway, and did so in defiance of every instinct in my body. No, I started uncertainly, relieved to finally be free of the vice-like clamp on my wrist. I considered running, but my stubbornness bested my survival instinct. I didn't want to run from such a meek, young woman 20 years my junior. You're right, Tracy, it simply won't do at all. What are we going to do about this? My father's bedroom door should be locked at night, shouldn't it? Other residents shouldn't be allowed to access his room. You and the other members of staff need to ensure that the bedroom doors are kept locked. Am I off the mark, or? No, you're absolutely right, Mr. Roberts. Tracy giggled and then her face fell into a frown. Michael must be punished. My eyes widened and the alarm bell in my mind tolled at a deafening volume. Every primitive instinct in my body had started screeching at me to run. I wish that I had listened. Well, no, I choked, fearful of the woman's implication. Punished? You shouldn't be punishing anybody in this home. I'm not blaming Michael and not blaming the staff. Michael's suffering from a mental condition that... But you said it yourself. Tracy interrupted with a hiss. Michael shouldn't have wandered into your father's room. There are rules, Mr. Roberts, and rules must be followed. Don't you think so, huh? Don't you think that rules ought to be followed? I felt as if I shouldn't answer, as if that were the most dangerous question that I had ever been asked, and the most dangerous person to ever ask a thing at all. But I've never been one to listen to an uneasy gut. Call it toxic masculinity or a desperation to dismiss magical and intrusive thoughts. But I know now what I either didn't know or refused to know then. That there was nothing intrusive about the thought at all. It was the most honest and valid warning that my brain had ever given me. I should have buttoned my lips. I shouldn't have answered. Well, of course rules ought to be followed. I replied hoarsely, voice still refusing to steady. But you shouldn't punish a mentally unwell resident, Tracy. That would be against a very different set of rules. Laws, codes of ethics. Yes, there are so many sets of rules in our wonderful world, Tracy said, wording every sentence in such a disjointed and inhuman manner. And then she released a sigh. It was the sigh of a soothed woman reflecting on something joyous. Sets of rules for sets of rules for sets of rules. But then things get a little confusing, don't they? Rules don't always abide by rules. You have rules, for instance, that conflict with other rules and on, wouldn't you say? Tracy was not herself. Worse than that, she wasn't like anybody. I know that sounds like a ridiculous exaggeration, but it's about more than what she said. It's about how she said it. I know what I felt, what I still feel. It's an emotion near impossible to describe, but I felt as if I were staring into the wide, red-stained eyes of something empty. Not a husk, no, that would have been better. There was something hiding in the supposed emptiness. There was certainly no soul behind those big brown pupils, tinged with red around the edges, however. There was something in there, something that I didn't want to see, something dark that crawled past her eyes. Are you okay today? I finally plucked up the courage to ask. You seem a little out of sorts, Tracy. I have to be honest, you're just so... sorry. I caught myself realizing that I was at risk of seeming impolite. Of course, it was a little too late by that point. What on earth are you doing? You've lost your head. This is all just in your mind. She's a weird girl, but she's harmless, I thought. Who are you to say that she's not quite herself? Those rational thoughts did a lot of heavy lifting, very nearly pushed out the truth. But I knew that the logical explanation for Tracy's behavior didn't quite add up. Knew that something had been wrong with the girl for quite some time, even before this odd day. She had been more than a quiet girl for those past few months. She had seemed not quite whole. She had seemed lost and frightened. Frightened, I realized. That's it. She's been frightened of something for months. I've seen it in her eyes. But she doesn't look frightened now. She looks peaceful. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to slot neatly together. I understood the significance of this transformation, this strange and horrifying new version of her. It was simply the culmination of those many quiet weeks, those weeks during which she had been silently crying for help, crying for somebody to save her from the great transformations which awaited. And I had finally noticed. But it was too late. "Oh, I'm fine," Tracy cooed softly before smiling again. "I'm better than fine, Mr. Roberts. I'm free. You see, I let him take the reins." She put so much emphasis on that word, him. I didn't like it. Not in the slightest, and not as I reflected on that darkness that I had seen crawling behind her retinas. What, I thought. You didn't see something behind her retinas, you maniac. That's impossible. Meanwhile, Michael was sobbing behind the nurse. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that man cried a lot. Not only during the night, supposedly, whenever the man would visit my father in his room begging for help. No, he cried whenever I was there too. Cried during all hours of the day. Sure, that's nothing unusual in a care home, but the content of his wails for help was always a little eerie and disconcerting. He was, as my father had said, was always crying about a woman, crying about something that crawled. "I'm sorry for bothering you, Tracy," I eventually had the wisdom to say as I started to back away from the unsettling woman, again coming to my senses a little bit too late. "I've been wasting your time. I made my point and I think we'll just leave it there. I'll let you get back to your job." "Don't you want to know who's taking the reins?" she asked me softly, moving forwards as I stepped backwards. I gulped. "I don't know what you're saying, Tracy. I just want to." "Oh, it's hard at first," she whispered, cutting me off. "Following the rules, I mean. Poor Michael struggles with it too. He's not quite ready yet, but he's nearly there. So nearly. And I struggled with it too. You saw me battling away for months and months, but I don't have to battle anymore. He does all the work for me. I had my chance and I blew it. Do you understand? When I slipped up and made a little whoopsie-daisy, he was there to help me." "Michael?" I asked. She smiled and shook her head. "Tracy, I'm not following a word you're saying. Is this some sort of nervous breakdown? Do you need to get somebody out here to talk to you? You're starting to unnerve me," I said. "I just wanted to sort out the situation with Michael so that my father—" "Oh, Michael has nothing to do with this," Tracy whispered, and she pointed a shaky finger at the ceiling. "I'm talking about the thing that crawls, the thing that whispers, the thing that we must obey if we don't want the bad and the worst to happen." I shivered and found that my shoes weren't shuffling backwards across the tiles any longer. My feet were firmly glued to the floor, either by a force beyond me or within me. I tried to lift them, but the fear and the force beyond was too powerful, and I felt it. A darkness was coming, It was already there. It had always been there perhaps, within or without. I'm talking about doing as he says. The nurse continued in a labored voice. Her breathing had become heavy and coarse, rough around the edges. You must always do as he says, Mr. Roberts. Please remember that. If you forget all else, remember that. It's the first rule, maybe the only rule that truly matters. You do as he says because he's the only one to be trusted. We doubt ourselves, but we never doubt him. And if you doubt that you followed the rule properly, you do it again, okay? Do it twice, thrice, 4 times, 5 times. Understand? I didn't manage to speak, didn't manage to move, didn't even manage to tremble in fear. I was wrapped in a body of stone. You must do as he says, and if you don't, there will be hell to pay. You don't want that, do you, Mr. Roberts? You want to still be in charge, don't you? I'll let that happen if you play by the rules. But the weaker you get, the more he worms his way inside until you belong to him. If he takes the wheel, you'll never break one of his rules again. But you'll never be you again, you understand? Excuse me, I yelled at another nurse named Rich. I need some assistance with your colleague. Rich frowned but nodded and started heading over. Moments before he did, Tracy leaned forward and whispered to me, You must do as the tall crawl bids. You must walk 11 steps per hour. Do his bidding and do not question it. Then you may be just about okay, just about human, just about alive. You may in fact be luckier than most. You may be allowed to hold on to the reins, to keep control of your autonomy. Tracy, Rich interjected, coming to a halt between the two of us. His eyes flitted from Tracy to me and back to Tracy. What's happening? She smiled and shrugged. Oh, no idea, Richard. Mr. Roberts seems a little distressed. It's your coworker who's a little distressed. She's not right in the head. She's been saying all sorts of unsettling things. I don't know whether she's having some sort of psychotic breakdown, but it's not right. What do you mean, sir? Rich asked. We were just having a disagreement about how to handle Michael. Tracy interrupted timidly, demeanor having shifted. She was a social chameleon and she had switched back to a relatively human setting. Mr. Roberts became quite loud and animated about the entire thing. That's not true, Ed. I began to shout before quieting as Rich lifted an eyebrow at me. I had played right into Tracy's hands, strengthening her narrative by losing my cool. I didn't have the mental or physical energy to get stuck in an argument and to try to fight any corner, so I conceded. You know what? Forget it. I've told you what you need to know, Rich, so it's up to you to do something about it. Tracy's not right in the head, but I don't care who you employ as long as my father is treated properly. It felt good, you know. It felt good to pretend that the interaction had been normal, to go through the proper line of authority, to treat Tracy as if she were simply a slightly strange woman, one going through some kind of mental crisis. Calling Rich over and explaining the problem in human terms had, for just a moment, helped to quiet the warning bell in my head, to loosen the knot in my chest. But reality is a cold and crushing force. As much as I tried to reduce the horror to something small and manageable and human, I knew what I felt. I knew that something inexplicable was at work. Something that crawled beyond just the eyes of the woman ahead of me. We'll treat your dad properly, Mr. Roberts, Rich said. Of course we will. We do treat him properly. Any complaints that you have are justified, but I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding. Just make sure that his door is locked at night, okay? I said. I don't want Michael or any of the other residents wandering into his room anymore. You understand? Tracy gasped. Why, of course, Mr. Roberts. That was all you needed to say. Rich sighed and walked away, mumbling something about not getting paid enough for this. And then Tracy smiled and mouthed 2 words at me. 11 stabs. I didn't have the courage to look at that terrifying lady a moment longer. As I turned and scurried back to my father and Claire, who was frowning over the commotion that I had just caused, I became aware of a darkening, a heavy cloud hanging over the room before passing a moment later. I still managed to convince myself initially that it had been a figment of my own imagination, that anybody else would call me crazy should I mention it to them. Just as with the crawling shape that I had seen, and possibly behind Nurse Tracy's eyes. I thought myself crazy and I was the one experiencing it. The one who knew deep down that it was real. "Why were you two arguing?" my daughter asked as I sat down. "It should be a pretty simple thing to rectify, shouldn't it? Just make sure that Grandpa's door is locked. What's so hard about that? It's why we pay so much money for him to live here, isn't it?" I shook my head and joked out. That's Nurse Tracy for you. She's a head case." My father looked into my eyes and I noticed that his own were teary. "I told you the blonde one is the worst in here." And then it clicked. And as I looked back at the blonde-haired Tracy who was back to tending to residents as if nothing had just happened, I realized my father hadn't been speaking ominously about Michael. He had been speaking about the nurse. The hour-long car ride back was stiff and silent. The mood was always a little somber during those drives home, but it had been a particularly eventful evening, and given that my daughter was feeling a little unsettled by the night's events, imagine how unnerved I felt. You might still struggle, of course, because my story is only words to you, but you'll understand soon when I tell you what happened to following Tracy's warning of the tall crawl. You'll realize that it was never in my head at all. The quietness of the car was one thing, but the fear was another. The burgeoning terror at the back of my throat. Not my mind, but my throat. Have you ever experienced such a thing? I was as if something were scratching and clawing and crawling its way up my esophagus trying to get out of me, or trying to work its way up to the surface so as to take the reins. The minutes of the car journey ticked by, and as they did, I became increasingly aware of something horrifying, that the fear was building towards something, towards a moment of calamity. I could feel it. Something bad was coming. And then I remembered how I had felt before getting in the car. I had been elated just before my daughter and I had walked out of the care home, felt as if I had completed something, accomplished some mission, followed some rule. 11 steps. It sounds insane, I know, but I had felt good because I had followed Tracy's rule. I had walked 11 steps within that first hour since she first told me about them. Of course, I had walked more than 11 steps to reach the car, but that was the bare minimum that I needed to achieve to appease this thing, of which the nurse had spoken. I had done it and completed the rule, completed both rules. Do whatever he bids and do it twice if you doubt yourself. Walk no fewer than 11 steps per hour. Anyhow, as the car journey home had passed and I had remained seated in the driver's chair, that gloom returned. The heavy black which had hung over the lounge of the care home. The terror had built because I hadn't done my next set of 11 steps. Another hour had nearly passed and I had remained firmly on my butt. "Have you lost your marbles?" I chastised myself, almost laughing out loud. "Are you seriously talking about following the rules of some deluded care home worker? You don't need to do a thing that mentally unwell woman says. You don't need to be scared of some tall crawl taking the reins. Get a grip, you idiot. You need to report her to social services, if anything. You should have reported her then and then, but you didn't. Why is that?" Because I was scared. Because Tracy was like no human that I had ever met before. Because the fear she passed to me like some kind of contagion was worse than any fear that I had ever felt. And I had no explanation for that. I'm just a man, an ordinary man, a mentally stable man. I've never really had problems with anxiety or depression or any other mental disorders. I'm as neurotypical as they come. Yet there I found myself being transformed into a deranged individual by a single conversation with an unnerving woman. A woman who had successfully terrorized those under her supposed care. And I had become her next victim. I didn't want to let that happen. And so I stubbornly stood or sat my ground. I didn't submit to that urge, the urge to pull over at the side of the road and walk those steps. Get back in the car feeling rejuvenated and free from the darkness for only a little longer. I gripped the steering wheel firmly as the horror grew and grew in my soul. And as I came closer and closer to reaching the end of the second hour, an hour during which I hadn't taken a single step, an hour during which I had broken Tracy's sacred rules, the rules of the tall crawl which threatened to take a hold of me. And then it happened. I lost control of the car. I didn't know why or how. There had been nothing in the road, nothing to explain the force which suddenly swept the vehicle into a tornado twirl. My daughter and I were screaming as the world beyond the windshield blurred, as the environment whizzed past the glass and our car started spinning across the road, almost as if aquaplaning despite it being the driest evening imaginable. There had been no natural cause for the car's sudden veering off the road. After a moment which felt eternal, there came only blackness. When I awoke, the world was upside down and revealed by the flashing lights of a not-so-distant emergency vehicle, an ambulance clinging to the grass beyond the shattered windscreen. The green blades formed the ceiling of the world and the black sky formed its bottomless floor. There was a tree ahead casting its long and impossibly black shade over our wrecked and overturned vehicle. A tree that felt not only upside down but backwards. That word entered my brain in a voice, not intrusive but real. Perhaps the realest voice that I've ever heard, realer than my own. It sounded clearly as if spoken by lips hiding within the recesses of my skull, and it terrified me beyond words when it whispered, "And don't walk in the shade of a backwards tree." And I felt it, that third rule, felt it stronger than anything I've ever felt before. It was the consequence for disobeying the tall crawl's rule of walking 11 steps per hour, but not the only consequence. As hands pulled my form out of the car, my eyes started to adjust to the world, and through the headache and the tears, my brain finally started to process the girl being carried to the ambulance. "Claire!" I screamed as my limp body was hoisted onto another stretcher. "Let's go! Get them both into the vehicle and get moving!" The paramedic yelled. It was a long road to recovery, not physically but mentally. All things considered, my injuries weren't too bad. I was alive, and it could have been far worse. I made it out of a hospital bed within a week, having suffered a broken ankle, minor internal bleeding, and a few cuts and bruises. I simply had to wear a cast and use crutches for the next couple of months. My beautiful daughter, on the other hand, had barely survived the crash. A punctured lung, 2 broken legs, a broken arm, and deep lacerations across her body. Those were the prices that she paid for my recklessness, my refusal to obey the tall crawl. And Tracy had warned me as such, warned me that should I not follow the rules of the entity which was passed on to me that evening, then I would face terrible and dreadful consequences. That something bad would happen not only to me, but to someone that I loved, perhaps to everyone I loved. I eyed my wife and other daughter in fear, praying that they would be spared for my carelessness. I wept by Claire's hospital bed for weeks until she was finally released in early February, by which point I was nearly out of the foot cast. Of course, in the weeks leading up to that moment, so much had changed. I had changed, had become better. You see, I understood the warning, understood that the car crash had been an omen, that I hadn't imagined the black cloud hanging over me, hadn't imagined the horrifying voice in my head, or the figure slinking out from behind the tree. The other horror that I had remembered in time from the car accident. The memory had come back to me as I was lying in a hospital bed one night. I dreamt both during the day and the night of the crash, replayed it over and over and over. And this one night I recalled something that I had either forgotten or pushed out of my conscious thoughts. As I had been dangling from the driver's seat upside down, eyeing that strange, topsy-turvy tree ahead, a shape had emerged from the blackness, illuminated by the glowing light of the ambulance. It had been the tall shadow of a man, or something vaguely resembling a man, with limbs elongated beyond anything earthly, anything human. But it was real and it had many forms. And when it had disappeared from view, it had crawled up the tree, crawled into the blackness of the night sky below from my upside-down view. The nightmare didn't stop there, of course. The tall crawl would return to me again and again, whether I were to follow his rules or not. It seemed I had no escape from him. Sometimes he would appear as a figure. Sometimes he was a black cloud hanging over a room, or he was a set of eyes watching from a coat hanging on a stand. Eyes that would have gone once the light had turned on. But he was always watching, and he would always know whether I would follow his rules or not. Completing 11 steps per hour by far was the most taxing of them. Every night's sleep was disrupted by my need to walk those steps, which was painful on a broken ankle, but not as painful as the alternative. And of course, my wife frowned at my hourly phone alarm. I hooked it up to Bluetooth headphones, but it often disrupted her sleep whenever I would get up during the night to pace the room, considering I would do it 8 times per night. As for the third rule regarding the backwards tree, I thought little of it at first. In truth, it was so nonsensical that I thought I would never have to consider it at all, that the tall crawl had given me the easiest rule in the world to follow, for there is no such thing as a backwards tree. It made no sense to me until that particular day in February, when I was driving Claire and the rest of the family home from the hospital. I felt it in the air, as I always do whenever he's around. Well, he's always around, of course. The tall crawl never leaves. But sometimes, as I said before, he's more present than others. Sometimes he comes up to the surface, showing himself as that dark cloud or that figure in the distance. And I felt it in the air, felt the surprisingly sunny February morning take a dark turn as we followed that country road. We took a bend sharply and my eyes began to water as I clocked the shade spreading over our lane, coming from a proud oak tree standing on the left-hand side of the road. There was something wrong with its bark, with its angle, with its everything. It was backwards. And I know that makes no sense, for there's no such thing as a backwards tree. But that was why I knew not to ignore the sign, not to make the error of disobeying the tall crawl again. I didn't dismiss the feeling this time, didn't dismiss the very real voice in my head. I screamed and swerved to the right, entering the lane of oncoming traffic, and everybody in the car screamed as we danced around the outer edge of the tree's abnormally long shade, a shade which seemed to be crawling further across the road, almost grazing the tires of our car. But thankfully we made it past, and I only swerved back into our lane once I had skirted entirely around the shadow. We missed an approaching vehicle by plenty of seconds, but not enough to avoid understandable screams of terror from my wife and daughters. "What are you doing? You nearly killed us all." There was, a hedgehog in our lane. I had to swerve to avoid it. I lied on the spot, still collecting my breath, which I hoped would explain the undeniable hesitation that had been in my voice as I had come up with the lie. I didn't see a hedgehog. My younger daughter, Odette, scoffed. She swiveled around in her seat to look out of the rear window. I only... But then the angry and animated girl stopped talking. Her sentence trailed off as she clocked something, and I clocked it too. Something inexplicable on the road behind us. The shadow of the backwards tree was retreating, pulling back across the lane in the grass, pulling back into the bark of the grand oak, which was readjusting its bark and adopting more of a natural and normal appearance, as if readying itself, as if returning to its slumber so as to lie in wait for another day, waiting for another chance to catch me off guard, to try to get me to break its rule. But that wasn't what terrified me. It was Odette. If my daughter had also seen the shadow crawl and the tree bark shift, that meant that I had to accept the truth that I had been avoiding for months. None of this is in my head. I told my psychiatrist, Dr. Rosetta, at our weekly appointment. It's all real. Because you suffered a car accident as a form of punishment for disobeying this woman's rule, she had asked. I shook my head. No, I know you call that confirmation bias. I know that you say bad things will always happen, and I'm just trying to draw connections between coincidences. No, I know this is real now because my daughter saw what I saw. The doctor nodded, seeming unconvinced. Right, the shadow and the tree bark. Well, I'm not here to reassure you. You may well be right. Maybe something is out there to get you. Of course, you took your daughter home in the early hours of the morning while the sun was rising. Shadows move as the day progresses. Not like this, I whispered, gulping deeply. And that doesn't explain the figure that I saw after the car crash. The tall crawl, the doctor said. And he's the one who makes the rules, right? Not Tracy, the care worker who upset you. Look, I don't expect you to understand. It's real, it's a fear unlike anything that you've ever felt before. Well, I don't doubt that, and I don't doubt that it feels real. But I've heard those exact words from patients before. I think that you have an obsessive-compulsive disorder. I groaned. No, I read all about that when I was researching my own symptoms earlier in this mental health crisis, as you like to call it. But it's not OCD. It's not just an anxiety disorder. When I don't follow the rules, bad things actually do happen. The doctor smiled as if it were a gotcha moment. Precisely. For people with your mental illness, the fear feels real. The rules you follow feel important. The idea that something bad will happen should you not follow them feels like an inescapable fact of the universe itself. That's part and parcel of the disorder, Mr. Roberts. You're suffering from magical thinking and... But I told you that I've never had any mental health problems, I interrupted. Why now, as a middle-aged man, would I spontaneously develop this disorder? Aren't people born with it? Well, research suggests a genetic link, yes, but that doesn't mean OCD reveals itself in all sufferers during their early years of life. Your situation may be uncommon, but it's not impossible for symptoms to present themselves in a person's later years. It's not OCD, I whispered, shaking my head once again. Bad things happen when I don't do as the tall crawl asks. Well, let's test that. We've been sitting here and talking for 40 minutes now. I see that you're getting very fidgety. I assume that's because you haven't completed your 11 steps yet, correct? I gulped, sensing where this was going. I'm not going to do it, I said, standing up. Just wait a second. Please, don't do the 11 steps. I'm just going to do a quick circuit around the room. Once I've done as it bids, I'll be safe and my loved ones will be okay. Then I'll sit down again. Just 20 more minutes, the doctor pleaded. Nothing bad will happen, I promise. Just give me 20 minutes and I'll prove that it's all in your head. What do you say? No, I said. As I took my first step, the doctor rose to her feet. Please, just listen to me. Nothing bad is going to happen. You'll see that this is all just in your head." Every fiber of my being screamed at me to take a few steps, but I wanted the doctor to be right. I wanted so desperately for this to be over. So I nodded and we sat. She talked about the weather and I nodded absent-mindedly, but my eyes and attention belonged to the clock hanging on the wall. The minutes ticked closer and closer as we approached 5 o'clock in the evening, the end of our session. The end of a whole hour since I had taken 11 steps. I felt my head pound, felt the darkness fill the room again. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to tell myself, "It's all in my head, it's all in my head, it's all in my head." And then that minute hand clicked into place on the 12 at the top of the analog clock. My doctor let out a happy sound while munching away on her sandwich. "You see, we made it to 5 o'clock. 1 hour without walking 11 steps. And we've reached the end of our session, Mr. Roberts. And what a wonderful place to stop because nothing bad." Midway through her sentence, the doctor spluttered and I opened my eyes, opened them wide, opened my mouth wider as I started to scream. The woman was clawing her fingers against her neck and she opened her lips to croak out pleading words. But all that came was blood filling her mouth and trickling down her chin. I yelled for help and the secretary dashed into the room and she screamed while I dialed 911, and the ambulance arrived within 7 minutes. It was incredibly quick, and the paramedics did all they could, but it was too late for her. A shard of glass was the culprit. How it had wound up in the woman's sandwich I didn't know, but I know that as the woman's body was taken away on the stretcher, reminding me of my own daughter following the car crash months before, I saw her eyes move. A dead woman's eyes rotated in their sockets and twisted to look at me. And they weren't her own. In fact, I had seen them before in the face of that terrifying care worker. The eyes of the tall crawl. And that brings me to the horror of the present day. Not knowing where to go or what to do, I have to find a way to break free from this curse without incurring the wrath of this demon. You see, I have not given up, not yet. Even with the darkness creeping closer and closer, even with the threat of that thing taking control, stealing my soul. I think despite how horribly things went for her, my doctor may have been right. Not about me having a mental illness, but about me needing to challenge the tall crawl, needing to beat it. I just have to be smarter about doing so. After all, whenever I disobey its rules, I do feel stronger and weaker at the same time. I'm not sure how that's possible, but it's the key and I'm certain of it. I plan to live my life. I'm taking my family on a road trip where I hope to clear my head. While we're out there, I'm going to tell them what's been happening and I know they'll be able to help me. I hope this story will help someone else out there. Someone facing the tall crawl. Someone who, like me, can feel it's burrowing more and more deeply into the back of his or her mind as time presses onwards. My name is Cedric Roberts and I don't have obsessive-compulsive disorder. I have a curse, but I'm going to defeat it.